The gas station cashier blinked, confused, as a teen in mismatched socks, a hoodie 3 sizes too big, and a look of total disbelief slapped a crumpled $5 bill onto the counter. "Hi, I was kidnapped by my neighborhood HOA and dropped off 3 states away. Can I use your phone? That's how I found out my son was alive. After 8 hours of panic, police alerts, and searching every corner of our town. My son, Jack, had been abducted by a group of suburban lunatics who thought enforcing the HOA bylaws gave them the right to commit actual felonies. Unfortunately for them, I'm the district attorney, and they just declared war on the wrong family. Just 2 weeks ago, we moved into Westbridge Hills, a picture-perfect neighborhood with trimmed hedges, matching mailboxes, and that eerie Stepford wife energy where everyone waves a little too hard and smiles a little too wide. I had just accepted a transfer to the city's central office, closer to the state border, and was hoping for a quieter life for Jack after a rough year. He wasn't a bad kid, just a teenage boy who thought sarcasm was a sport and had a deep, undying love for skateboards, weird playlists, and challenging authority figures. He was everything this HOA hated. Our first warning sign came exactly 3 hours after the moving truck left. Jack did a quick lap around the cul-de-sac on his board, earbuds in, hoodie up, and oblivious to the fact that he'd just committed neighborhood sacrilege. Within minutes, a woman in a pastel pink tracksuit with a clipboard materialized in our driveway like she'd teleported. Her name was Karen. Of course it was. She introduced herself as the president of the Westbridge Hills Homeowners Association and Community Standards Officer, as if this suburban title granted her actual law enforcement powers. She cited Jack for reckless sidewalk activity, disturbing the peace with bass-heavy music, and, no joke, unauthorized wheel-based recreation. She even mentioned something about neighborhood harmony quotas. At first, I brushed it off. Karen seemed annoying, maybe a little power-trippy, but nothing more. I told her politely that my son wasn't disturbing anything and that she could send any official complaints to me, the property owner. She looked mildly offended, scribbled something on her clipboard, and marched off. Jack, of course, laughed. "This place is like a cult with yard flamingos," he said. I should have listened more closely to that joke. Over the next week, Karen and her compliance team, a ragtag bunch of overzealous retirees with too much time and too many walkie-talkies, ramped things up. Jack got warnings for leaving his hoodie on a porch chair, parking his bike too close to the ornamental hedges, and not waving at a neighbor within the required 3-second social grace window. We got handwritten notes, emails, and even a formal letter accusing Jack of intentional disruption of visual uniformity. One neighbor actually took a photo of Jack's backpack on the lawn and posted it in the neighborhood app with the caption, "Littering now? What next?" Jack, being Jack, didn't back down. He started pushing buttons. He rode his skateboard wearing a cape made from an old HOA newsletter. He mowed the lawn in zigzags. He put googly eyes on our security cameras. I warned him not to poke the bear, but he was 16 and thought he was invincible. Besides, who expects a suburban HOA to retaliate like a cartel? Then came the day he disappeared. It was a Wednesday. I got home early from work and noticed the house was empty. No Jack. His phone was off, which was unusual, but not alarming. I figured he went to the skate park. When he didn't come home by dinner, I called around. No one had seen him since noon. I tried his friends, checked his usual spots. Still nothing. By 8 p.m., I'd filed a missing persons report. By midnight, I was panicking. Then, at 3:12 a.m., my landline rang, one of those calls that jolts you awake in full dread. On the other end was a gruff voice with a southern drawl. "Sir, I got a boy here sayin' he was dumped at the side of our station by some people in a white van with HOA logos. He says you're his dad. You Mason Grant." I was already grabbing my coat. My son had been kidnapped by the HOA. They had actually loaded him into a van, crossed state lines, and left him at a gas station like an Amazon return. When I got to him, he was sitting on a curb eating beef jerky and drinking a root beer. His hoodie was torn, his hair a mess, but he grinned when he saw me. "Hey Dad. You're gonna love this story." My relief was so overwhelming I nearly collapsed. But then the DA in me kicked in, and every ounce of anger, fear, and professional fury crystallized into a plan. These people thought they were above the law. They thought community rules let them override federal law. They thought no one would notice a kid missing for a few hours. They didn't know who I was. Back at home, I pieced together everything Jack remembered. 3 HOA members. Karen, a guy named Harold, and someone Jack called Clipboard Bob, had approached him mid-afternoon. They said he was being relocated for violating civic peace standards. Jack thought it was a prank until they chloroformed a rag, not to use it but for theatrical effect. They literally waved it around like a cartoon, then loaded him into a van wrapped in vinyl decals that read Westbridge Hills Youth Outreach Initiative. They drove for hours, spouting bizarre HOA slogans about resetting behavior and reclaiming suburban identity. Jack said he played along, asking for mood music and pretending to be a runaway child prodigy from MIT. They finally dumped him at a gas station with $20 and a bottle of sanitizer. That was the moment I decided I wasn't just going to prosecute them, I was going to dismantle them. I'm not talking about a slap-on-the-wrist civil suit. I'm talking federal charges: kidnapping, unlawful restraint, endangerment of a minor, interstate abduction. I had the tools, the connections, and now the motive. These people wanted to play judge, jury, and neighborhood executioner. Time to show them what a real courtroom looks like. Jack, for his part, was thrilled. He made a TikTok about his abduction called "Kidnapped by Karen," my HOA horror story, which went viral within 12 hours. The comments were split between disbelief and calls to burn the HOA to the ground. I was already working on that, legally. The game had changed. The HOA had no idea they'd just dragged the district attorney's son across 3 states in the back of a repurposed carpet-cleaning van. They wanted order? They wanted control? They were about to learn what real power looks like when it's backed by the law, and a father with nothing left to lose. The second I got Jack home, he collapsed onto the couch like a rag doll and fell asleep mid-sentence, still halfway through a story about how one of the HOA board members insisted on stopping for gas and made him buy a granola bar as payment for disruption. I sat at the kitchen table, phone in one hand, legal pad in the other, and pure fury coursing through every nerve in my body. My son had been abducted. This wasn't an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. This was a straight-up criminal act, orchestrated by suburban busybodies with too much authority and absolutely no common sense. And now they were going to pay. The first call I made was to Detective Simmons, an old friend from the state police. He picked up on the second ring, groggy but alert as soon as I said, "It's about Jack. It's bad." I gave him the bullet points: minor taken across state lines, unlicensed individuals, HOA involvement, gas station drop-off. There was a long silence on the other end before Simmons responded in the way only he could. "You're telling me a neighborhood association kidnapped your kid like it's a boot camp for bad behavior?" I said yes. He said, "Okay. I'll get the task force ready." By morning, the house was filled with law enforcement energy. Jack was still asleep, and I intended to let him rest, but I needed answers. So I started building a timeline. I pulled the doorbell footage from our Ring cam, and there it was, grainy but clear enough. At 1:37 p.m., a white van with the HOA logo pulled into our driveway. Out stepped Karen, Clipboard Bob, and Harold, all in matching polos that looked like they were printed for a failed corporate retreat. They knocked, talked to Jack for a few seconds, and then, with ridiculous ceremony, escorted him into the van like he was some unruly luggage. They didn't force him, exactly, but they definitely manipulated the situation. Jack looked confused, then annoyed, then shrugged like he was going to humor them. That shrug would haunt me for days. But Jack had always had a sharp wit and a long fuse. I didn't realize how much of both he'd use in that van ride until he woke up later that afternoon and told me the full story. According to Jack, it started with Karen rambling about suburban decency initiatives and corrective excursions. She claimed the HOA had developed a character reset program for youth displaying non-compliant behaviors, which apparently included skating, wearing dark-colored hoodies, and not attending the community pancake breakfast. Jack, unfazed, decided the only way to stay sane was to mess with them. So he told them he had a rare condition called selective authority blindness, where he was medically incapable of recognizing illegitimate power. Then he asked if they had clearance from the Department of Juvenile Affairs. That apparently threw Harold into a panic, who whispered to Karen that they should have gotten a waiver form first. Karen, however, doubled down. She told Jack he was being relocated to a recalibration station. That recalibration station turned out to be a dusty roadside gas stop with a vending machine, 2 cracked benches, and a bathroom that hadn't been cleaned since the last Olympic. They gave him $20 and told him he had to find his way back with integrity, then peeled out in the van like they'd just completed a covert op. Jack had wandered into the gas station and convinced the attendant, who looked like he hadn't cared about anything in years, to let him use the phone. That's when I got the call. The part that stunned me most was how calm Jack had remained. He said he knew they were idiots, not real criminals. That gave me relief, sure, but it also made me realize how brazen these people had become under the illusion of power. They didn't think they were kidnapping anyone. They thought they were administering justice. That delusion was more dangerous than outright malice. I contacted the local news, but carefully. I didn't want to alert the HOA just yet. I needed evidence. I needed their own words, their own files. So I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. Rita Thompson, former Marine, current neighborhood dog trainer, and resident with a long-standing grudge against the HOA. Rita had once been fined $300 for improper grass blade orientation. She took that personally. Rita invited me over under the pretense of discussing leash laws. Inside, she had a wall covered in HOA-related printouts, notes, and schedules. It was like walking into the conspiracy theory bunker of someone who'd snapped from too many bake sale argument. She handed me a flash drive and said, "I've been recording HOA meetings for years. Thought they were corrupt. Didn't think they'd go full mafia." I took the drive home and loaded it onto my laptop. What I found was both hilarious and horrifying. In one meeting, Karen proposed a behavioral adjustment trial for Jack, citing an aura of dissent. Bob chimed in that Jack reminded him of a young anarchist. Harold, sounding more unsure, suggested they ask the city first, to which Karen snapped, "Mason Grant is the city. We must act decisively." Another recording showed them plotting the so-called recalibration trip. They used phrases like urban cleansing and reset run. They even budgeted for snacks. These people had planned this out with spreadsheets, maps, and a disturbingly cheerful PowerPoint titled Operation Curb Appeal. That was it. That was enough. I forwarded everything to Simmons, who looped in the FBI. Why the feds? Because the moment they crossed the state line with a minor, it stopped being a local crime. We were in federal felony territory now. I drafted the warrant requests myself. As the DA, I had to hand it off to avoid conflicts, but I made sure the new team understood the scope. These weren't just HOA zealots. These were people so drunk on neighborhood control that they thought a teenager's hoodie was a threat to civilization. Back in Westbridge Hills, the HOA was blissfully unaware that they were hours away from being investigated by multiple agencies. Karen sent out a community email titled, "A Win for Order. Our neighborhood stands strong," and in it she vaguely referenced removing disruptive elements. I saved the email. I also printed it. And then I sent a copy to every news outlet I could reach with the subject line, "Suburban HOA brags after kidnapping teen." The headlines would come soon enough. That night, Jack and I sat in the backyard, eating takeout and watching our security lights flicker on and off as neighborhood cats wandered through. He looked relaxed for the first time in days. "So," he said between bites of lo mein, "what happens now?" I told him the truth. Now we build the case. Now we press charges. Now the HOA gets a taste of real authority. Jack raised his root beer in a mock toast. "To Karen," he said. "May her spreadsheets rot." He had no idea how right he was. The clock was ticking, and Karen's kingdom was about to come crashing down, under the full weight of the law. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the wheels of justice were already turning. I sat in my home office, files spread across the desk, reviewing footage, transcripts, and audio logs. Simmons had confirmed that the FBI was now officially involved. They weren't just looking at the kidnapping anymore, there was suspicion of broader activity. Financial fraud, impersonation of licensed professionals, even misuse of public resources. The Westbridge Hills HOA had built itself a private fiefdom, and no one had questioned it, until now. Across town, the HOA board members were holding an emergency meeting. They had no idea their conference room was bugged. One of the HOA's own members, Doris, had turned informant overnight. She'd been on the board for years but never agreed with the growing extremism. When she heard what happened to Jack, she contacted Rita, who passed her along to us. Doris wore a wire and walked into the HOA clubhouse like it was just another budget meeting, her purse holding a microphone that fed directly to an agent's laptop. The meeting started with Karen pacing like a general, arms crossed, eyes twitching. She looked rattled but not remorseful. Harold was sweating through his pastel blue polo, and clipboard Bob kept nervously tapping a pen against the table. Karen slammed a folder down and declared, "We need to get ahead of the narrative. Jack is fine. We returned him safely. If anything, we provided him with structure." Harold muttered something about structure with snacks, and got a glare that could cut glass. They began drafting a public statement. The first draft read, "The Westbridge Hills HOA denies all allegations and was acting under its charter to protect community values." Bob wanted to add something about Jack being a voluntary participant in a corrective field trip, but Karen shot that down, saying, "We can't call it a field trip, Bob. We crossed a state line." Think. The moment she said it, Simmons and the other agents listening in marked it down. Verbal confirmation. She admitted it. My blood pressure spiked with satisfaction. Meanwhile, Jack was still riding the wave of overnight fame. His video had hit 1.2 million views. He'd titled the follow-up, "Escape from HOA Island," and detailed his van journey in hysterical fashion, calling Harold Discount Vin Diesel, and narrating Karen's monologues like they were Shakespearean tragedies. It helped that Jack had a natural talent for storytelling and an audience that hated HOAs as much as we did. The internet was a wildfire, and Karen had just dumped gasoline on it. But the HOA wasn't going down without flailing. Later that afternoon, they released an official video through their community website. Karen sat stiffly at a long oak table, flanked by Harold and Bob, reading from a typed script. She wore a blazer with a brooch shaped like a birdhouse. Behind her hung a banner that read, "Preserving Peace Through Compliance." The video was surreal. She began by stating, "Our community has always prided itself on standards. Sometimes those standards require difficult actions to maintain the harmony we cherish." She then spoke about temporary corrective outings as part of a new pilot program that, according to her, had yet to be fully ratified. The video backfired instantly. It was clipped, memed, and mocked across every platform. Late-night hosts were already joking about the HOA that kidnaps kids for lawn violations. One user dubbed the video with dramatic music and retitled it Karen's Manifesto, "Suburbia Strikes Back." Another made a fake movie trailer for Van of Shame, starring Meryl Streep as Karen and Jack Black as Harold. That same night, I received the call I'd been waiting for. The search warrants were approved. Law enforcement would begin collecting HOA documents, digital communications, and internal records first thing in the morning. This wasn't just about Jack anymore. Turns out, the HOA had a long history of what they called quiet relocations. Over the last 2 years, there were at least 6 other teens who had mysteriously left the neighborhood under vague circumstances. One family moved out with no explanation. Another had filed a complaint with the city but dropped it days later. Until now, there had never been enough to connect the dots. But Jack's case changed that. It lit a beacon. Back in the clubhouse, Karen was starting to crack. She called an emergency session again the next morning, but by then 2 board members had already resigned and gone to the authorities. One of them, a mild-mannered dentist named Eugene, confessed to forging a wellness note from a so-called licensed behavioral specialist recommending Jack's temporary separation. That specialist turned out to be Karen's cousin Greg, who, after some digging, we discovered had no medical credentials, unless you counted his expired dog obedience certificate. The cherry on top came when agents raided the HOA's record room and found a binder labeled Community Correctional Initiative. Inside were pages of profiles, including photos of teenagers, notes on their behavior, and color-coded plans for moderate to intensive recalibration strategies. Jack's file was labeled Stage 3, Symbolic Repositioning, which sounded like a dystopian euphemism for exactly what it was, kidnapping. But even with all the evidence mounting, Karen didn't stop. She went on local radio to defend her actions, claiming that Jack's refusal to conform posed a danger to community morale. When asked why she thought she had the authority to forcibly remove a child, she responded, "Because no one else was doing anything. We had to preserve order." The radio host paused for a second, clearly stunned, and then replied, "You do realize that's literally what tyrants say, right?" Karen didn't flinch. "Then maybe tyrants have a point," she said. The next morning, she was arrested. I watched from the living room window as 2 black SUVs pulled up to the clubhouse. Agents entered calmly, and within minutes, Karen was led out in handcuffs, still shouting about bylaws and citizen arrest right. Jack was standing beside me, holding a bowl of cereal and watching like it was the season finale of a long-running show. "Do we get popcorn for this part?" he asked. I didn't answer. I was too busy thinking about how quickly the line between control and chaos had been crossed, and how dangerous it was when ordinary people believed rules gave them the right to override the law. But it wasn't over yet. Karen might have been in custody, but the trial was still ahead. The community was fractured. Neighbors divided between those who supported Karen's twisted order and those who'd lived in silent fear. Some claimed it was all a misunderstanding. Others were packing up and moving out. One thing was certain, though: the days of unchecked suburban tyranny were done. Jack would never forget what happened to him. And neither would I. But now, with Karen behind bars and the HOA under investigation from every angle, it was time to go further. It was time to show the country just how far these people went, and how far I was willing to go to bring them down. Because justice wasn't just my job. It was personal now. The courtroom was packed tighter than a 4th of July block party, except instead of hot dogs and lawn chairs, the crowd was made up of reporters, angry parents, federal agents, and neighbors who had once been fined for leaving their trash bins out past 9 a.m. The air buzzed with tension, anticipation, and just the faintest scent of popcorn from someone in the back row who clearly misunderstood courtroom etiquette. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a spectacle. Karen and her merry band of clipboard-wielding misfits were facing federal charges, and the nation was watching. Karen entered flanked by 2 defense attorneys, her hair sprayed into a helmet of suburban defiance, her lips tight with barely concealed rage. She wore a beige blazer and a pin shaped like a recycling symbol, as if to remind everyone that she once organized the community Earth Day cleanup. Her eyes scanned the room and settled briefly on Jack and me. She didn't flinch, but I saw the microsecond twitch in her jaw. The mask was cracking. Jack sat beside me at the prosecution table, technically just a witness, but emotionally my anchor. He wore a plain suit, which he hated, and sneakers, which he insisted on. When asked why not dress shoes, he said, "I want them to remember who they tried to kidnap." Fair enough. He looked calm, but I could see the tension in his fingers, tapping rhythmically against the wood. This wasn't just about justice for him, it was about finally being heard. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Rowley, laid out the charges one by one. Unlawful restraint of a minor, kidnapping across state lines, impersonation of licensed professionals, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and obstruction of justice. Karen's defense? That she was acting in the best interests of the community. That her corrective outreach program was misinterpreted. That Jack wasn't kidnapped, he was temporarily redirected. The jury didn't buy it. Especially after Rowley played the meeting recording where Karen literally said, "We must act decisively. Mason Grant is the city. We need to handle this our way." That line landed like a thunderclap. Karen sat rigid, refusing to show emotion, but Bob, sitting a few chairs down, audibly groaned and dropped his forehead into his hands. Harold looked like he was trying to teleport out of the building using sheer panic. But nothing topped Jack's testimony. When he took the stand, the entire room leaned in. His voice was steady, his story detailed. He walked them through the day he was taken, how Karen and the others came to the door with fake smiles and fake authority, how they convinced him he had no choice but to come with them, how they used legal-sounding nonsense to make the absurd seem official. He told them about the van, about the ridiculous conversations, about how they argued over whether granola bars counted as lunch. People laughed at that part. He let them. But then he told them how it felt to be left at a gas station with no phone, no idea where he was, just a crumpled $5 bill, and the weight of realizing these people thought what they did was normal. Then came the bombshell. Rowley asked him if he had anything else to share. Jack reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a USB drive. He'd saved something the HOA didn't know he had, audio from inside the van, recorded on a voice memo app running quietly in his pocket. He played it on the court's speaker system. Karen's voice echoed through the room, clear as day. "The boy is disruptive. This is a service to the neighborhood. When he comes back, maybe he'll be grateful." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush stone. The defense tried to argue the recording was incomplete, out of context, taken without consent. But it didn't matter. The jury had heard it. The truth was no longer buried in paperwork and HOA policy mumbo-jumbo. It was right there in their ears. Karen's meltdown began during cross-examination. Rowley asked if she had any formal legal authority to remove Jack. She responded with something about the HOA charter and moral obligations. Rowley pressed again, asking who gave her permission to cross state lines with a minor. Karen snapped. "This would have worked if he wasn't your son," she shouted across the room, pointing at me. "He was ruining everything. We built this neighborhood for peace and respect, and he brought chaos." The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. By the time the closing arguments came, there wasn't much left to debate. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict on all counts. Guilty. Karen sat frozen, blinking rapidly, as if reality had just slapped her with a rolled-up HOA newsletter. Harold cried. Bob tried to pretend he wasn't part of any of it, even though his signature was on everything. The court ordered immediate custody for Karen, pending sentencing. She was escorted out of the courtroom by 2 U.S. Marshals, still ranting about bylaws and community integrity. But then came the twist we didn't see coming. As the crowd filtered out, a man in a dark suit approached me and introduced himself as Agent Kowalski with the Department of Justice. He handed me a sealed folder and said, "We've had an eye on this HOA for a while. Westbridge Hills wasn't the only neighborhood running rogue operations like this. Karen was part of a much larger pattern. We needed a public case to make the rest crumble. Your son gave us that." Inside the folder were documents linking Westbridge Hills to a network of overreaching HOAs sharing illegal strategies, fake professional referrals, and even a hidden online forum where they discussed reconditioning community members. I was stunned. This wasn't just one rogue HOA. It was the beginning of uncovering a suburban underground of wannabe vigilantes with clipboards and delusions of grandeur. Jack had not only brought down Karen, he had exposed something far bigger. The press swarmed us as we exited the courthouse, shouting questions, snapping photos. Jack waved politely and said nothing. When we got to the car, he looked at me and said, "So, does this mean I still have to mow the lawn?" I laughed for the first time in days. The trial was over. The verdict was in. But the real reckoning had just begun. Karen might have believed she was preserving order, but what she really preserved was a perfect record of her own insanity. And now, with the nation watching, it was time to clean house. Not just here, but in every HOA that had ever gone too far. Jack hadn't just survived the van ride from hell. He'd flipped the whole van over. 3 weeks after the verdict, Westbridge Hills looked like a war zone, not in the sense of destruction, but in the way a neighborhood looks when its oppressive regime has finally collapsed. The iconic HOA banners were gone, the rigid lawn measuring signs had vanished, and no one dared fine anyone for leaving a garbage can at the curb. A sense of freedom had replaced the suburban tension that had hung like a fog for years. For the first time since moving there, people actually smiled at each other without a clipboard looming in the background. The neighborhood was healing. Karen, now officially an inmate awaiting sentencing, had gone silent. Her legal team had filed a desperate appeal, citing misinterpretation of authority and emotional distress, but the court wasn't buying it. The footage, the recordings, the public statements, they'd all painted a picture too vivid to deny. Her sentencing date was set, and the federal prosecutor had already recommended the maximum. Meanwhile, Harold and Bob had both taken plea deals in exchange for testimony. Last I heard, Harold had taken a job in Idaho selling camping gear, and Bob was undergoing court-mandated therapy to confront his chronic overcompliance disorder. No, I'm not kidding. That's what his lawyer actually called it. Jack, on the other hand, had become a local legend. His podcast, originally titled Vandalized, now expanded to Suburban Hostage. HOA horror stories had blown up beyond anything we expected. Listeners from all over the country wrote in with their own stories. Being fined for wind chimes, HOA board members measuring grass with rulers, one family even received a cease and desist letter for planting non-regulation tulips. The more absurd the stories, the more traction he got. Jack turned what could have been a traumatic ordeal into a platform that called out abuse of power with humor, grit, and perfect teenage snark. And then came the block party. It started with a post from Rita, the ex-Marine neighbor who had helped gather intel early on. She suggested the community celebrate its liberation from Karen's reign with a good old-fashioned, no permits needed, no dress code, no measuring tape block party. Within hours, residents were pooling together tables, grills, lights, and speakers. People who hadn't spoken in years suddenly bonded over shared horror stories, like the time the HOA threatened to evict an elderly couple for having a flamingo lawn ornament out of season. The party was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Lawn chairs lined the street, music blasted from portable speakers, kids ran through makeshift obstacle courses, and someone even brought in a taco truck. Jack set up a small table with a sign that read, "Ask me how I took down the HOA," and people actually lined up for selfies with him. Someone spray-painted, "HOA Free Zone," on the side of the clubhouse in giant letters, and instead of erasing it, neighbors added to it, writing thank you messages, drawing cartoons of Karen being abducted by her own HOA van, and posting quotes from the trial that had become internet gold. My favorite part came later in the evening, when the mayor of our small city, who had largely stayed silent during the trial, showed up unannounced and handed Jack a certificate titled Community Resilience Award. Jack stared at it, then asked if it came with a scholarship. The mayor blinked and said no. Jack shrugged and handed it back. Let me know when it does. The crowd erupted in laughter. But the real shock came the following week. Jack got a call from the governor's office. At first, he thought it was a prank. But when a government car showed up at our house with actual state officials, we realized it was real. The governor had been following the case closely and wanted Jack to speak at an upcoming summit on community rights and local governance. Apparently, the story had triggered a statewide review of HOA regulations, and Jack had become the unlikely poster child for neighborhood justice. He didn't even hesitate. Sure, he said. But only if I don't have to wear a tie. At the summit, Jack stood on a stage in front of hundreds of officials, activists, and legal experts and told his story. But he didn't just talk about what happened to him. He talked about what it meant. How communities forget that rules exist to serve people, not control them. How authority without oversight breeds arrogance. How the scariest thing isn't a dictator, it's a neighbor with a clipboard who thinks they know best. The room gave him a standing ovation. I've won cases that made national news, but I've never felt as proud as I did in that moment. The fallout from the case reached far beyond our neighborhood. Other HOAs across the state were audited. Several resigned overnight. One entire HOA in a neighboring suburb voluntarily disbanded after a teenager spray-painted, "Don't Karen me, bro," on their clubhouse door. A state bill was introduced to set clear limits on HOA powers, requiring transparency, third-party oversight, and a formal grievance process that didn't involve someone like Karen acting as judge, jury, and psychological relocation officer. And as for our family, we found a new rhythm. Jack and I got closer than ever. What started as a quiet move to a peaceful neighborhood had turned into the wildest legal battle of my career, but in the end, we came out stronger. Jack still skated down the sidewalk in front of the house, still wore his hoodies, still blasted his music a little too loud, but now no one dared to say a word. Not even the new interim HOA president, a retired librarian named Nancy, who told everyone her only rule was, "Don't be a psycho." Karen was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 6. The judge called her actions a dangerous abuse of imagined authority, and said she had shown no remorse. Her final words in court were, "I was trying to help," and the judge replied, "You helped yourself to a false sense of power." That line made the nightly news. We still get letters. People from all over the country send thank yous, podcast fan mail, even requests for Jack to come speak at their school event. One letter came from a woman in Arizona who wrote, "I didn't think anyone could stand up to our HOA. Then I heard your story. Now our whole community is voting them out." Jack keeps a copy of that letter on his wall. Sometimes I think about how it all started, with a skateboard and a hoodie. One ordinary kid with a sense of humor and no tolerance for bullies. One outrageous overreach by people who forgot what it meant to be neighbors. One father who just happened to be the district attorney. They thought they could scare him, silence him, remove him. But instead, they gave him a voice and a very large audience. And that's the thing about power. Real power doesn't come from clipboards or bylaws. It comes from truth, from standing up when it's hard, from refusing to be intimidated by people who confuse control with leadership. Jack reminded all of us what that looked like. And now, no matter where he goes, he'll always be known as the kid who brought down the HOA. Not with fists or fury, but with facts, sarcasm, and just enough chaos to set a neighborhood free.